Ever wonder how important sidekicks are really? An independent book is a book owned and produced by its creator. But the term is confusing because it can also refer to an independent publisher or a guy trying to sell his own book at a convention. Things like Image Comics are considered an independent publisher because they do publish creator-owned comics. But I do want to spend one day out of each month looking at the truly indie comic books. Today, we're going to be looking at Darby Pop Publishing. If you are interested in supporting this publisher and purchasing the books, I'll be putting all of the links down below. Our tale begins with a gun in a guy's mouth. His name is Richard and his life as a sidekick is getting the better of him. His girlfriend wants to leave him because she wants him to be more than a sidekick, and it's too much. Why does he even try anymore? But that's when his friends call him up. Hey Rich, Al had a rough day. We're all gonna meet down at the bar. Hopefully you can make it. The guys all meet at the bar and Al explains that he's been a sidekick for 5 years. Flying Fox and the Jolt. Flying Fox is one of the richest superheroes around, and Jolt has never asked for anything. But now that his car's broken down, he simply asked for a loan, and the self-centered prick said no. The guys agree. Howie, the Flying Fox, is rich, and he has a ton of cars. And Flying Fox and Jolt have saved each other's lives numerous times. Flying Fox could have easily given him a car and the problem would have been solved. They keep rolling the problem over and over until Al gets furious and one of the bar patrons bumps into him. So he shocks him with his powers. The guys quickly get Al out of the bar and they get him back to his place where he passes out, and Atlas spends time paying off the man so that he doesn't sue. As Rich and Dan are leaving Al's house, Rich asks Dan if he ever thought about hanging up the tights, becoming a civilian 9-to-5er. And Dan tells him how could he do that, break up Mustang and Captain Celerity? Brian would get in so much trouble without his sidekick to protect him. The next day, Mr. Marvelous is battling against Inferno in the center of the city. Richard, aka Phantasm, is cleaning up the rubble that the battle keeps dropping onto the streets, and he's ripping off the curious passerbys. Once Mr. Marvelous wins the day, he stops, poses for pictures with the police, and then he waves goodbye to the civilians before flying off to save the day again. But it's Phantasm that gets the crap, as the civilians want to know who's gonna clean up this mess. The two of them fly over the city and Phantasm looks at him. Kevin? But Mr. Marvelous ignores him. Kevin. Mr. Marvelous. Yes, Phantasm? You almost hurt a lot of people when you slammed Inferno into that building. The falling debris could have seriously injured people, or worse. That's why I have you to back me up. You may be the best sidekick in Chicago, but I'm the hero, so don't tell me how to do my job. I'm beloved by this city. You're replaceable. And they fly off into their next fight. While this is happening, Al is breaking down and getting a job at the local burger joint to try and start saving for his car. If only he could have had some help from his supposed friend. Meanwhile, the Scepter and Atlas are fighting it out with the villain, and the Scepter is running into problems when he realizes that Atlas isn't around. The villain knocks the Scepter's scepter away, and then he begins to drown him in a water bubble. During this, Atlas was saving a woman that fell into the bay, and as he gets back to the scene, he quickly knocks out the villain. He then runs to the Scepter's side, and the Scepter wants to know, where was he? His entire job is backup. He's a sidekick. Atlas then went to his day job at the newspaper where he suggested a story about the sidekick Atlas, and the chief told him, a story about sidekicks isn't a story fit to print. On the other side of the city, there's a bank robbery in progress, but luckily Mustang and Captain Celerity show up. Captain Celerity, being a speedster, runs around and drops all of the thugs, but he missed the one with the gun, so Mustang used his powers to knock the gun out of the villain's hands. Then, the civilians all go over to thank Mustang and not Captain Celerity. And when one of the civilians calls Captain Celerity Captain Quick, it's too much for the hero. He fires Mustang. So Dan goes back to Richard's place, where Richard is still debating putting a gun in his mouth. Dan convinces Richard to go out, where he tells him that he was just fired by Captain Celerity, and Richard explains what a jerk Mr. Marvelous was. But that's when Dan has an idea after seeing a Teamster bumper sticker. He tells Richard to get all of the sidekicks to the bar. Dan tells them he's tired of it. He's tired of being walked on by the heroes, pushed aside by the public, and the media ignores them. Things need to change. It's time for the sidekicks to go on strike. And they do. The sidekicks refuse to help their heroes. The guys all finally relax and enjoy their lives. They read books, go to local baseball games, they get to know the women at their jobs, and they make a difference by helping at homeless shelters, or just getting a steam bath. They literally ignore phone calls from their superheroes. Richard even gives his gun to Dan. He realizes that he was in a dark place, and he explains that he didn't see the point anymore, but now, he wants to save himself. And Al, the guy who was working a job to get money for a new car, well, he let his burger joint get robbed, because he's not a superhero, is he? Right away, the heroes began to feel that something was off, because right after a fight, Mr. Marvelous has to deal with the very angry civilians that he hurt with falling rubble. He stood by and let the police help the injured, and they began throwing rocks at him, calling him a reckless idiot. Even the newspaper Atlas worked at noticed, where are all the sidekicks? Everything was going fine and the sidekicks were living happily again, but the question did come up. What if the villains exploit this? Because there's supposedly an alliance of supervillains in Chicago, the board of directors. But Dan told everyone, they're just a myth. Sadly, they aren't. And they noticed that the sidekicks were missing, and they have a plan. It's time to take advantage of this. Begins swiftly with the Flying Fox's signal going off, but instead of the commissioner, it was Professor Payne, someone that wasn't even one of the Flying Fox's villains. The scepter was then dropped by a car, and then Atlantis was attacked by an angry mob controlled by Coral. Captain Celerity was sniped and he simply ran away with the bullet in his shoulder. Everyone agreed that it was time to go back to work, but Dan told them no. Mr. Marvelous was still out there and he still thinks that he could save this city alone. The heroes are only now feeling the sidekick's absence, and Mr. Marvelous needs to as well. While it is true the heroes are starting to realize it, and even the public is starting to realize that the sidekicks are needed, Mr. Marvelous still didn't see it. And eventually, the supervillain Crimson confronted him. Right off the bat, one of the other villains hits Mr. Marvelous with a microgravity pellet, forcing him to the ground, and then Crimson goes in, beating the tar out of Mr. Marvelous with his new gloves. Because as Crimson said, being invulnerable never motivated Mr. Marvelous to actually learn how to fight. Dan called Richard that night to let him know that Mr. Marvelous was hospitalized, and Richard went there as quickly as he could. Mr. Marvelous struggled to get out two simple words once he realized Richard was there. "I'm sorry." And Richard made the call. It was time to get back to work. So Dan called together his friends and they agreed it was time to fix the issue that they had started. Working as a proper team, they ambushed Mercenary by combining their powers to drop him. They then pulled his mask off to discover that he was nothing more than a rich old white guy. They take his suit and they start tracking it back to the board of directors' hideout. But while they're in Jolt and Flying Fox's secret cave, Flying Fox comes down and demands to know what they're doing. If Hobson let them in, he's gonna fire that stuck-up Brit. But Jolt wanted to know what was wrong with him. Why was he here and not fighting the villains? Is this what he wants? A population overrun by the villains? Flying Fox replies quickly, no, it's not. And so he decided to help them backtrace the suit. The team heads straight to their base where they find Coral working his magic on the crowds to get the passerbys all around the building while the rest of the supervillains are showing up. The sidekicks all decide that before they go in, they're gonna need to watch for collateral damage, because super teams have never really taken off after the damage in New York. And they don't want Chicago to be another example. So Mustang opens up by blasting Coral, and the rest of the sidekicks jump in and they begin taking out each of the supervillains. Anytime one of them runs into a problem, the others jump in and they save him. While this is going on, the supervillains' henchmen are watching the news and seeing their bosses failing. But the henchmen have decided to have their own strike, because sometimes a henchman with powers and costumes is just an evil sidekick. With all the villains except for Crimson defeated, Captain Celerity walks over to Mustang to apologize. He was running ever since he got shot to clear his head, and he asks Mustang if he can be his sidekick. But Mustang tells him, no, you can be my friend. The sidekicks aren't done yet though. Crimson realizes that he underestimated the sidekicks, so he launches multiple missiles at Phantasm. They would have worked, except Frostbite ices them all over. Then Crimson hits Phantasm with a gravity device, pushing him to the ground. So Mustang opens fire on him, and Frostbite begins icing over Crimson. He does a good job of disarming each sidekick individually, but as a team, they can't be stopped, and they break open his helmet, stomping him. The city honored them that day with a ceremony, and Dan stepped up once again to give another speech. To let everyone know that while collectives of superheroes haven't worked in the past, it was because it was made up of people who put themselves first. But for Chicago, it works, and there's a new super team in town. But across town, those henchmen, they've decided to strike out on their own, because they're tired of being sidekicks. Like I said, this is something new that I want to bring to you guys once a month. Nothing too extravagant. I don't want to go crazy and start hammering you with this every week, but I want to do something truly independent. And if you want to support Darby Pop with this comic book, then purchase the book down below, digitally or on their Amazon store. I'm Benny the Comicstorian, and have a good day.